Hello, everybody. I don't want to cut anybody off. Awesome. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Heritage Hour. I recognize a few people. I see some new folks as well. So thank you so much to all of you for being here today to support Randy's work and learn from him. I'm Turner Douglas, Program Coordinator with Heritage Services. This is our last talk of 2024, so thank you for all of your support over the previous months. Everybody's shown so much interest in local heritage, and it's been a real pleasure meeting all of you. Heritage Hour takes place in Cataraqui on the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. We are grateful for their care and stewardship over this land and for this opportunity to learn here together today. And of course, today we are learning from Dr. Randall Bagg, who will be telling us about his exciting work with Ontario Barn Preservation. This initiative is dedicated to saving historic barns and raising awareness regarding their cultural significance and contribution to our rural landscape. Randy has a background in veterinary medicine and history and has spent his life working in barns. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bagg.
Can everybody hear me okay? We're okay? That way I won't have to hold that wand up around. Hello and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for coming out today. First, I want to thank Turner and the City of Kingston Heritage Services for inviting. You can't hear? So we're going to have to use this. There, I think.
There you go.
I don't know how close I have to get here. Really close?
Yeah, a little more tilted is good.
A little more tilted? Okay, this is going to be entertaining. Anyways, I'll start again. First, I want to thank Turner and the City of Kingston Heritage Services for inviting me here today to talk about saving Ontario barns. And I'm going to admit to you up front, I'm not a barn architecture expert or a barn repair expert by any stretch of the imagination. However, I have spent my life working in barns, and I do have a passion for them. And I think that, and I believe that barns have a unique architectural significance, but maybe more importantly, they hold the stories of rural families in Ontario that made a livelihood working in those barns. And I think that's really what makes them special, and I think worth saving. There. So this is the agenda that I'd like to cover in the next 40 or 45 minutes. And so first of all, I'm going to talk about the organization, Ontario Barn Preservation, what we're trying to do and how we're trying to do that. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of background information on myself and try to explain how I ended up here today in front of you talking about barns. And then spend most of the time talking about different types and characteristics of barns. And I've got some pictures and some old barns that I think are quite interesting. And I've included 3 from the City of Kingston as well. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about a project that Ontario Barn Preservation has initiated called Your Old Barn Study, in which we're trying to do a survey or a census of barns across the province, capture information on them in a digital format, and then be able to preserve them that way. So, first of all, sorry, I'm going to have to find the right spot here so I can see what I'm actually put up here. So Ontario Barn Preservation began in 2018 when a group of people, all with a passion for barns, got together and decided that they needed to form an organization that would advocate for barns. And so in 2019, Ontario Barn Preservation, and I'll use the acronym OBP going forward, was founded as a volunteer-run, not-for-profit organization that's governed by a board of directors, and I've been a director for the last couple of years. We also have regional representatives across the province and covering most of the counties of the province now, and those regional reps are the contact points for barn owners with the OBP organization. The vision for OBP, I think, is pretty straightforward, but it's our dedication to saving barns in Ontario, which includes their unique and I think significant architecture. It includes the contribution of barns to our rural history in Ontario, and I think they also contribute to our rural landscape. The other point I want to bring up is what we mean by the word preservation, and we use it in a broad sense to include different forms and methods of preservation. Obviously, the most desired method of preservation is to preserve the actual physical barn, but we realize that's not always possible or practical in all cases for barns. And so then we broaden out preservation to include a digital format, and that's what we're doing with a project called Your Old Barn Study, where we're collecting information and then storing that information about barns from the barn owners in that digital format. And I'm going to talk more about Your Old Barn Study at the end. So how does OBP advocate for saving barns? And we have 5 objectives that we've set out for ourselves in order to do that. The first objective is we want to share information and knowledge about barns with barn owners. And so on our website, we've got a whole bunch of information on how to assess barns, how to repair barns, how to repurpose barns. And so barn owners can go in and have access to that information. And then we do blogs that we post on the website as well. And then we have one page on the OBP website called Special List. And so on there are a listing of contractors, consultants, suppliers that all have an expertise in barns, and so they're listed on there, and barn owners can contact those people for help with their barns. The second objective is that we want to encourage networking and exchange of information, knowledge between barn enthusiasts, and we have a few ways that we do that. First of all, we have a Google Groups chat room that we allow for members to, if they've got a question about barns or their own barn, they can post that on that chat group and then get feedback from the other members in OBP. We've initiated this year what's called Tenant Talks. So these are video conference calls usually at 7 p.m. at night, and one of the members will come with information about a specific barn and pictures, and they'll present that to the group on the call, and then there's a discussion amongst everybody afterwards. And these have been fairly popular and are quite interesting. There's been some interesting barns so far. We have done barn tours in the past, and we're starting to plan some barn tours for 2025, and I think it would be great if we could do one in Eastern Ontario, so that's something that I've been considering, and I'll try to advance for next year. And then we have a social media presence. We're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and we post on there very routinely. We have one member that he takes pictures of barns, mostly in south of London and in Western Ontario, and he's posting barns at least one a week that he gets into, has pictures from the inside and the outside of the barns. The third objective that we have, again, is this project that we launched called Your Old Barn Study, where we're trying to do this survey of barns called Your Old Barn Study, and I'll talk again more about that at the end. And then the fourth, is this working? The fourth objective is about understanding and perhaps influencing government policies and regulations that impact barns. and whether or not they're looked after or they're kept up. And so we've begun to engage with the Ontario government in some of their policies. We're starting to engage with municipal governments. I was in and talked to the city of Kingston a few months ago. And then we're also engaging with other stakeholders that might influence some of the policies, including heritage associations and farm group associations as well. And then the last objective, and this is more aspirational at this point in time, but we're exploring funding opportunities where we would have a pot of money and we could fund barn owners who want to do some project, repair project or repurposing project with their barn. And we don't have a pot of money now, so don't ask for that. But in the US, there are farm organizations that do this kind of work, and they've accessed money through fundraising and through private donations. So that's something we're not really actively doing that right now, but that's something that we're going to certainly explore going forward. So a little bit about myself. So I grew up on a, sorry. Oh, sorry, I'm not used to this. Is that better? I feel like I'm swallowing it almost, but anyways. So I grew up on a Jersey dairy farm just north of Toronto in what was then the village of Maple. It's now the city of Vaughan. And I spent every day of my life until I went away to university working in barns. But I'm pretty sad to say that my father's barns, my grandfather's barn, my uncle's barn are all long gone to the urban expansion of Toronto. And I find that a little bit sad, more than a little bit sad, because my brother and I reminisce about the barns every once in a while, but we're the last two that remember those barns. And if we can capture some of our memories, at least they'll be recorded for people in the future. I threw in a couple of pictures here just to prove I grew up on a farm. The picture on the left is me with my father on his brand new Massey Harris combine, and I think the picture, by the size of me, I wasn't too old, but I think it was about 1958. And I put this picture in because I found it amusing that this was state of the art back in the late 1950s, and it didn't have an air-conditioned cab or a GPS system, and it had a dinky little umbrella, which I guess try and keep the sun off you, but it sure didn't keep the chaff from the header of the combine from blowing in your face. And we thought a good day, if we could do 8 to 10 acres of grain in a day was a great day. And nowadays they probably, I don't know, they probably do that in an hour or two. So anyways, times change and technology changes. And then the picture on the right is me in front of my grandparents' house, and looks like they were trying to put me to work raking something, and that was my dog Roger that I still remember. These are the pictures of the 3 farms and barns that I grew up in. And so the one on the upper, hit the wrong button. The one on the upper left is my grandfather's farm. And this was located just north of Toronto on Highway 7 and Keele Street. So believe it or not, this was Highway 7 back then, one lane each way. It's probably, I don't know, between 407 and Highway 7, it could be 20 or 30 lanes now. And my grandfather bought this farm in 1912, and he developed a very successful Jersey dairy herd on that farm and barn. Unfortunately, he died in 1959, and the farm was pretty quickly sold to the Canadian National Railway. And again, quickly, they built a huge rail yard over that farm. And you can still see that rail yard as you're going across the 407 just past Keel Street. You can see that. The barn on the right is the farm and barn that my father milked cows in during the 1950s. And again, it's right across the road from my grandfather's farm, so that's Highway 7 again. And that barn disappeared in the 1960s as well, and there was factories built on that land. And then this barn on the bottom left is the one that I remember the most. This is where my father milked cows from 1960 up until the 1970s, when he sold his cows in quota back in the 70s. Some days I wish he'd kept his, well, I wish he'd kept the cows, but it would have been more fun if he'd kept the quota, because it's worth a lot more money nowadays. But this barn and farm is on Jane Street. If anybody here has been to Canada's Wonderland, it's about 4 or 5 kilometers north of Canada's Wonderland on Jane Street, which I remember was a dirt road, but this farm, and well, the barn disappeared, I'm not sure exactly when, I think in the 80s or 90s. I think it got taken down and might have been used for, moved by Mennonites up into Western Ontario. But this land now is finally being, in the last 5 to 10 years, is being developed as well. So, you know, it's not pleasant, but the urban expansion of Toronto's really taken a toll in that area. So I spent most of the 1970s going to the University of Guelph, and I graduated as a doctor of veterinary medicine in 1979, and then I went into a large food animal practice, and so I worked mostly on dairy cows, and the practice was just north of Brampton in Peel County. So I did dairy cows, I did some beef cows, I did sheep, goats, and horses. But again, I saw the issue of urban expansion. Brampton was getting bigger, Mississauga was really growing. So then in 1994, I left practice and I went and worked for the next 24 years in an animal health pharmaceutical company. I did clinical research on farms, and I did technical services, regulatory work with Health Canada in Ottawa. But part of the technical services was I got to call on farmers and veterinarians, mostly beef and dairy farmers across the province, and so I got again into lots of barns. I retired in 2018, and because I'd always been interested in history, I decided in 2019 to go back to school. So I enrolled as a part-time senior student at the University of Guelph, doing a BA and with a history major. And the good part about being the senior part was that it was free tuition. And during my studies, I managed to graduate from that in October of 2022. I got my degree. But one of the courses I took when I was at the University of Guelph was an experiential course that was sponsored by the Ontario Barn Preservation. And it was about developing a survey to input barns from barn owners and collect information on them in this digital database. And that's how I got involved with OBP. And then I did the course and I just kept going, and I got deeper and deeper after that until I'm totally ingrained into it now. So now I'll spend some time talking about old barns and what I think makes them interesting and important. I'm going to highlight some common types and characteristics of barns. I've got one slide on how to age your barn, or clues that might help you try to age your barn. Another slide on the challenges facing old barns, and they're pretty severe and numerous at this point in time. And then finally, I have a slide on, why do we even want to save old barns? And I think that's an important question to ask, and I think there's a good answer to it, but I'll look at that as well. So types of old barns, and by far the most common type of old barn in Ontario is what's called the timber frame, heavy timber frame barn. And so these are barns that are built of wood. There's posts and beams and braces and rafters and purlins. Oh, I gotta keep hitting the wrong button. So when we look at these barns, you can see the wooden posts, wooden beams. We've got more posts in between here. We've got some braces. And the defining element of a heavy timber frame barn is a structure that's called the bent. And so the bent, you got to think of the skeleton that holds everything together in a barn. So the bent holds up the walls, the end walls, the roof, and the bent, there will be a bent at each end of the barn, and then they're repeated at usually the same distance across the length of the barn, and there can be anywhere between 4 to 8 bents usually in a barn. So this is the bent here in this barn. You can see there's a post here, there's another post on the wall, there's beams across here, there's braces going up to the roof, and then there is another bent you can see at the back here. Posts, beams, braces. And so again, they're repeated at intervals across that length of the barn, and they hold everything together. The other term that is used a lot for barns is a bank barn. And bank barns are typically will be built into a hill or a grade in the land. And I'll explain why at the end, but it allows access to the upper part of the barn. So that would have been on the opposite side of this barn, but this is the upper side on this barn. So you've on the uphill side, you've got access to the upper part of the barn where you're going to store the feed and the bedding for the animals. And then on the bottom, the hillside, we've got the access to the stable or foundation of the barn. And it'll quite often have a stone foundation. And you can see how the height of this stone foundation changes from the uphill side to the downhill side of this barn. And the reason that they built bank barns like that was that on the uphill side there was less of an incline on that barn bridge, and you can see it over here, there's not much incline. So less of an incline to get into the upper part of the barn. So think back when they were bringing a wagon or a team of horses with a wagon that had hay or straw on it or grain, and they were bringing it into the barn. With less of an incline, it was a lot safer and easier to get that team of horses up that barn bridge and into the upper part of the barn. Stone barns, there are locations in the province where there's stone barns, where stones are obviously available. I lived in Guelph for a long time, and because we were close to the Niagara Escarpment, there was lots of stones south of Guelph, and so there was still a few stone barns that were left in that area. And since I've moved to Kingston, I've learned there's a whole new subset of stone barns called limestone barns, and I've included a couple of those later pictures of 2 of those barns. So I'm not sure where this stone barn, I think it was in the Guelph area as well. So before I came up to speak, one of the gentlemen talked to me about swing beam barns. And we have one director that's very interested in what's called swing beam barns. And these are barns that have a beam. So this is a barn that was converted into a house, But swing beam barns have this beam that goes from one wall to the other wall without a post in between. And you can see it on the bottom picture here as well. So this is one wall, here's the swing beam, and then the other wall. And they typically are a little bit thicker in the middle. I think that's, I'm not an engineer, but I think that was to help bear some of the weight of the posts and the beams that were above that. And the reason that they built swing beam barns was, again, think back to the 1800s when they were bringing a team of horses and with a wagon on behind, they would bring that up through the barn doors into the threshing floor and unload whatever, the hay or grain or straw. And then they could take that team of horses and go underneath the beam, swing them in 180 degrees, and have them come back out the barn door facing forwards. And that's a good thing with horses, to keep them going forward. Trying to back them up is not that easy. And even when you think about wagons and tractors, I don't know if anybody here has ever tried to back up a tractor with a four-wheeled wagon behind it, but it's not the easiest thing to do. So those are swing beam barns. And I understand there's quite a few in this area as well. So round barns or multi-sided barns, I think there's somewhere in the order of 15 to 20 round barns still in the province. So they're fairly rare. This one is located at the Milton Heritage Agricultural Park. It was moved there from another location along Steeles Avenue at the very north edge of Toronto. And it was somewhat renovated. I don't think there's too much access to this barn anymore, though it's still used, I think, for some storage and some meetings, but at least it's still standing. When we go back further in time, we have what are called ground barns or log crib barns. So these would have been more commonly built in Ontario up until, say, about 1850. They're typically just one story, so the livestock and the feed would have been kept on the same level. And there's no stone foundation that was built under these. This one is quite interesting because it's got horizontal barn boards as well. And I think by far the vast majority of barns in the province would have vertical barn boards. But if you see those horizontal ones, usually they're older barns, but there was some. You can't always go by that because there was some that were built into the 20th century that might have had horizontal. And then another type is this roof truss barn. And so roof truss barns became more common in the 20th century, probably after the First World War. And these are typically built with prefabricated kits of lumber, so 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x8s, and then assembled, and there would be hardware that would be to put all of that together. There was different companies had plans on how to build these. There was a Beatty Brothers in Fergus after the First World War that had plans, and so you see Beatty barns around the province. My uncle had a roof truss barn that was attached to his original old barn, and so it was fun when you were building a mow and you got up towards the top there and had to try and fit bales around all those pieces of lumber up there. So aging barns, and it can be quite difficult. So far with Your Old Barn Study, we're asking people how old their barns are, and I found it interesting. A lot of people don't know exactly when their barn was built. And the easiest way to find out is maybe to go to the municipal office and look at the records. But a lot of the barns built in the 1800s didn't have building certificates. And so that doesn't help you out. But inside the barn, there are some things that you can look at. The first one is the type of wood cut on the lumber that's used in the barn. So on this side, we have hand-hewn lumber, and then here we have sawn lumber. So hand-hewn lumber would obviously be the older barns, probably 1880s, 1890s. And then as we, get into sawn lumber, where, those would typically be very late 1800s into the 20th century. Roof style can give you some indication of the age of a barn. By far, the vast majority of barns in Ontario have two types of roof styles. One is the gable, and the other is the gambrel. So the gable roof is a simple one-pitch triangle, and these would have been the earliest barns would have been built with a gable roof. And then as we get into the 1880s, when livestock became more prevalent in Ontario, and we needed more feed and bedding for that livestock, you needed more storage space for that in the upper part of the barn, so they started to build these gambrel roofs. And gambrel roofs have two pitches, and you can see that there's probably more area under that roof line for storage of feed. You have to be a little bit careful though, because some of the earlier gable roofs were converted on barns were converted into gambrel at some point, so it's not always foolproof about that. Nails can help a little bit. The nails that hold up the barn boards on the side of the barn. The earliest nails were these square cut nails, and then as we get into the about 1900 or 1890, we get into manufactured spiral nails, and so you can that can give you some idea as to the age of the barn. Foundations style can help. The earliest foundations were stone foundations, and then probably post-World War I, when poured concrete became available, we get into concrete foundations. And there's a big blog on the OBP website that goes into a lot more detail about that. Challenges facing barns. And it's pretty alarming to see the rate at which barns are coming down over the last, I would say, 20 to 30 years. And urbanization is part of it, neglect is part of it, and then obsolescence is another part of it. These barns are old. Their time and weather has taken a toll on them. They're 150 years to 200 years old now. Modern farming needs have changed a lot, I would say, since about, say, 1960. And when we look at modern farming for dairy cattle, for swine, for poultry, there's specialized housing that is a lot better for health and animal welfare than keeping those species in the old barns. I would say that typically what the livestock that's being kept in old barns today would be beef cattle, horses, and there's still some dairy cattle that are in tie stall barns that are being milked in tie stall barns. But generally, we've moved away from a livestock use for old barns. Urbanization is obviously a big problem. The developers move in, they buy the property, they neglect the barns, or they, either take them down either purposely or through neglect, they come down. Repair costs for barns can be pretty daunting. You're talking, these are big structures, and you're talking typically at least tens of thousands of dollars, if not more than that. And if there's not an economic return, I think barn owners have a hard time justifying whether they're going to put that money into repairing the barn. lack of recognition for the history and the stories that barns have and can contribute to our society, I think is a problem. Some barns are being repurposed and converted, and I've got a couple of pictures here. Oop, did it again. A couple of pictures. Some barns are being converted into houses, and a couple here, and then some barns are being repurposed into event spaces, and some into other businesses, fruit markets, wineries, that type of thing. But you know, to convert a barn can be a costly endeavor. To get these buildings up to modern day codes is not always easy, and not always possible in some cases, but not always easy in others. So I think an important question is, you know, why do we want to save old barns? And, you know, I think first of all, they are, you know, a big part of our rural history in Ontario. And again, they contain stories and memories for people. I think they contribute to the landscape. I know when I go out for a Sunday drive in the countryside, I'm usually looking at the crops and I look at the barns. And you know, if I see a barn that's well looked after, that's you know, all the barn boards are on it and it's maybe painted and all that, you know, that, I don't know, that gives me a happy feeling. So I think they do have some aesthetic value. Yes?
Is that particular barn still standing?
I'm going to talk about that.
I've been in that barn.
Yes, it is. So, and then also these barns, again, contain the stories of people and their livelihoods and what they did in those barns. So I think, you know, there's value in that. So this barn, yeah, this is a good news story on this barn. So there's only 3 12-sided barns in all of Canada, and this is the only one in Ontario. It's located in northern Ontario, somewhere up around Sault Ste. Marie, between Iron Bridge and Thessalon. Maybe you know better than I do. But this barn was purchased by a group of interested citizens a few years ago and actually moved to a park near Thessalon, and it was repaired and renovated and maintained, the heritage value of it. And so now it's used as a community space, and they have a Saturday farmers market at this barn. So you know, this is a great story of keeping a very unique and important barn standing, and I think for the foreseeable future it'll have value. Now some stories that barns that maybe aren't quite as happy as that one, but these are 2 barns that Ontario Barn Preservation has been tangentially involved with in the last couple of years. So I'll talk first about the barn on the left, which is the DL barn. So DL is how you pronounce D-A-L-Z-I-E-L. That's Scottish. I've had it on good record that I'm saying that correctly. So the DL barn is the oldest known standing barn still in Ontario. And it was built in 1809 by a Mennonite immigrant from Pennsylvania named Johann Schmidt. And then it was sold in 1828 to a Scottish immigrant named DL. And the barn and the farm stayed in the DL family up until the 1950s. This barn is located on the very northern edge of Toronto. So it's at Jane Street and Steeles Avenue, for anybody that knows that part of Toronto. And it's part of Black Creek Pioneer Village, which is operated by the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority. Unfortunately, the Black Creek Pioneer Village has 2 sides to it. There's one on the City of Toronto side, and then if you go on the northwest corner of Steeles and Jane Street. There's another part, and that's the city of Vaughan. So where this barn is has been closed. Black Creek Village part has been closed for over 20 years now. And the barn really was starting to get into some disrepair, neglect more than anything. And so there's a group of interested citizens now, including one of the DL descendants, that want to come up with some funding, consistent funding to keep this barn repaired, and come up with more importantly, I think, a long-term visions on how they're going to operate that property and keep it going forward, and keep it going forward into the future. There's another barn on that property, as well as a house, and I think a sawmill as well. So, there's some pretty significant history there that it would be, we need to figure out how we're going to maintain that and make something that's viable going forward for it. It's an interesting barn because it's got, you can see it looks like logs on the end here, and it's kind of, to me, it has a Mennonite style to it because it's got this overhang on the upper floor above the stable, and it's got horizontal barn boards along here as well. So I've been trying to get down and get into the barn. They have tours every once in a while, but as you can imagine, it's complicated. The City of Toronto's involved, the City of Vaughan's involved, the Regional Conservation. So, trying to get all those government bodies aligned on what they're going to do with this barn and property is difficult. The barn on the right is the Kid Barn, and it's located just south of Guelph in the city of Guelph, and just on Brock Street or Old Highway 6. And it's significant because it's the last known slotted stone barn in the city of Guelph. So it's hard to see, but you can see a slot in the stonework here. I think there are some other ones here, but they're obscured by those vines. So I think those slots were probably for ventilation and light into the inside of the barn. This barn was built in the early 1840s by a Scottish stonemason named Thomas Kidd. So the city of Guelph has just recently designated this barn as a heritage barn, but it's not in very good shape, and you can't see it here, but the wall around on this other side here is mostly collapsed or partially collapsed. And the barn and the property is owned by Madame E. Homes, and this area of Guelph is slotted for development, residential and commercial development. And so I don't know what's going to happen, but Madame E. Homes has objected to the heritage designation. I think it's gone to a tribunal. I mean, it will be very costly to even get this barn repaired to, so it's safe, let alone, to some state where it could be utilized, repurposed. And so, difficult question. In my mind, it's too bad that this barn hadn't been designated 20 or 25 years ago. And then, when a developer moves in, maybe they can think about, how do I repurpose that barn and integrate it into a residential neighborhood, which I think would be amazing. But anyway, so that's the Kid Barn. Now some barns from the city of Kingston. The first one is, I've called it the Upper Farm Barn. So this barn is located not far from here. It's in Rawdon Park, the Calvin Park area of the city of Kingston. And I don't know that much about the history, but what I know I think is pretty interesting. So this barn was built as part of the Kingston penitentiary system. And the land it's on was purchased from Sir John A. Macdonald in 1875. And then the barn was constructed and finished, and there's a limestone house on there as well in 1880. And it was constructed through convict labor. So they went and quarried the limestone slabs and helped build the barn. And then the barn became a workplace for convicts, and the farm was a source of food for the penitentiary system. This is, I got to go in this barn about 3 weeks ago, and it's quite an interesting barn. It's really very big too. It's quite long. Some of the interesting things, well, obviously the limestone blocks, or ashlar they're called, I think are pretty amazing. It's got a simple gable roof, but it's got 3 cupolas on top, so those cupolas would have been for ventilation and lighting into the inside of the barn. It's oddly built, at least to me. It's built into the side of a hill, so the bottom part of the barn is kind of sunk down in the middle, and the windows are high on the sides of it. It's hard to tell where the original floors were anymore. The city's renovated and put some office space for one of their departments in there, and then I think the Parks and Rec, the greenhouse section of the city, uses the bottom part for storage. The city's recently, and they're still working on doing some repairs and renovations to maintain the heritage value of this building, but they put on a steel roof and they redid the cupolas, and they have this amazing copper sheeting that's on the top of them now. They're repairing any of the limestone blocks that are starting to degenerate, and they're redoing the mortar to make it more of a historical appearance to it. They've maintained the original entrances. This is the entrance on the north side. I took a picture, and you can see the old wood door and the hinges on that. So this is I think a great example of maintaining a heritage barn and repurposing it, and being able to use that barn and integrate it into the city. The next barn I included was the Beamish House barn, and so this barn is behind the Beamish House, which is at Sydenham Road and Princess Street, for anybody that drives along there. And this barn was built when it was a doctor's house, I think, the Beamish House, and so it was built about 1850. It was designated, I believe, by the city in 2017. So this is the picture from in that time. And I just drove in one day. I couldn't get in. I tried to get into this barn, but I didn't manage to be able to convince the owner to let me in. I should have just knocked on the door and walked in, I guess. But you can see that they've renovated it, and in the interim, so it's got a new steel roof on it. Looks like they've cleaned up some of the limestone, the outer part of the limestone. They've put in some new doors and windows in it. But my understanding is that the building's being used for offices, meeting space. So I think that's, it's great. Like, that's again another example of repurposing a barn that's going to be able to stand there for a long time. And then my last barn in Kingston is the Lemoyne Point barn. So this is, I'm sure everybody knows where this is, but it's on the very south side of the Lemoyne Point Conservation Authority. So if you go out Front Street out to the corner of Collins Bay and Lake Ontario, and it's very close to the path when you're going through the conservation area. And so I took this picture about a month ago, and right off of the path. Well, I might have got up close to the fence line, but so this is I find this a very interesting barn. I guess what really caught my attention the first time I saw it was the water tower. I don't know if I'd seen a water tower on a barn like that before, but when I got thinking about it, I think they probably pumped water out of the lake or the bay into that tower, and that's how they fed water into the barn, rather than, I think, drilling a well through the limestone. So that's pretty interesting. It's got a gambrel-style roof to it with 2 pitches. It's got a ventilator on the top, so that would have been for air circulation in the barn. It's got a hay hood. So this little peak here is a hay hood, and then there's a hay door. And unfortunately, one of the doors, the hinge has come off, and it's laying there askew. Also, I found interesting is that it has horizontal barn boards on it, or shiplap is another term that they use for that. And I sent the picture to one of my colleagues who's seen a lot of barns and knows more about them than I do. He thinks this barn's probably built post-World War II from one of those like kits, designs that were put out. He called it I think it was Beatty or Eaton barn. He called this one, it was an Eaton barn. He said there was a lot of them out on the prairies in Western Canada that were built that were very similar to this. So this barn, you can tell it's in a bit of disrepair, and I don't know that much details about what's going on with the property, but my understanding is that, you know, there's a possibility that the city may acquire this, but whatever happens to the property, I would hope that, you know, they include some plan on how they would, you know, integrate the barn into that plan and repair it and perhaps repurpose it and make it available to the public. So finally, I'll just quickly talk about the project that we're doing called Your Old Barn Study. And this again is we have a survey, an online survey that barn owners can go in. They fill out information, they upload pictures into the survey, and then that goes into a big database that we can then analyze what's in there. It was done in conjunction with the University of Guelph and their history department, and the professor, and I took one of her courses, was Dr. Kim Martin. And so barn owners collect the information on their barn. Probably, I think the wisest thing is to go back, sit at your kitchen table, and upload the information. It usually takes less than half an hour to put all the information in. Importantly, and I know some people have been concerned about this, but all of the data and the surveys are located in a password-protected environment on the University of Guelph servers, and all of the personal information, we have a disclaimer in the survey, but all of the personal information is under Ontario privacy standards. So, and the other thing is, and I should state this, that what we're doing with Your Old Barn Study is no way connected with any heritage designation, and we're actually, you know, we do not want to get involved in that at all. So if anybody has that as an issue, I hope I can dissuade you from it. We have no mandatory questions in the survey, but there are 2 things that we would really like to have on every barn. One is the barn owner. We'd like to know who the barn owner's name is and some contact information. What's their phone number? What's their email? And then the other thing that we would really like to have is the location of the barn, whether that's the old you know, county, township, lot concession system of location, or a GPS location, or the mailing address. We'd really like to know where the barn is to be part of our analysis. So what are we trying to do with Your Old Barn Study? I mean, obviously we want to collect all this data, analyze it, and be able to do research on what we're learning about Ontario barns. And I think with that, as we release information, and we have the first release of, we did the first 115 barns that were put in, and we just have a short summary of that that's now available. But I think when we start to publicize some of that, it's going to help us to get more barns in and help people understand about trying to save barns. And then because we're in a digital format, we can, if we get enough information, measurements of the barn, pictures, we can recreate these virtually and in that digital format. And I think, there's probably endless possibilities with that. I'll just quickly comment on the picture here. So this is a barn raising from back in 1885 in Western Ontario. And I guess when I see this, what I take away is barn raisings back then were social events. Like, there was a lot of people there. And the other part is that barn raisings were part of a labor exchange amongst farmers. And, if I helped you raise your barn, you were going to come and help raise my barn. So one of the other courses I took at the University of Guelph was transcribing rural diaries. And the diary that I did was a Scottish immigrant near Fergus, Ontario, so north of Guelph. And he kept a diary for 40 years. But in an 8-year period from 1885 to 1892, he went to 20 barn raisings in that little community. So I find that just, you think about how many were built, and I'm sure he attended all of them, and his family did, and partook in putting them up. So what kind of information are we looking for? I'll go through this quickly, but I talked about we want the barn owner and the location. We'd like to know what year the barn was built. If you don't know, we've kind of got some ranges. If you think it was before 1850 or 1850 to 1900, you can check off a box for that. Want to know the construction method. Is it heavy timber frame? Is it stone? Etc. We're asking barn owners to, if possible and safe, to measure their barns. So we'd like to know how long they are, how wide they are, how high the walls are, how high the stable is. And we don't want you getting up on a ladder to measure the wall height. There are laser apps on phones now that can do that, so it's a lot safer. So we don't want you to do that. We have a table about the physical condition of the barn, and so this is in there. So all you do is you go down and you check off the answer to, looking at the roof, at the walls, at the floor, the foundation, and then the beams and posts. What's the condition? And so we've got these definitions to help you figure that out. We want to know the shape of the roof. And again, most barns are gable or gambrel, but I've noticed we already have a monitor barn in the database, and we have one round barn from the Caledon area north of Toronto. We want you to take lots of photos of the barn and upload those. Photos of the outside, so from each side, a perspective photo. Want you to take photos of the inside of the barn. We're really interested to see what the bent, if you can. It's hard to get the bent though if you get in the right spot to try and get the whole bent in there. But if we'd like to see as much of that as possible. We'd like to see the underside of the roof, the rafters, the purlins. The threshing floor, if you can, and so the threshing floor is where the barn doors open up onto in the upper floor, so if you can take a picture of that. Mortise and tenon. So the mortise is the hole in the wood, and the tenons are the pegs that go in there. That's how they put those beams and posts together. And then we've got a whole section on special features of a barn. And I think there's over 70 different special features And we've got pictures and definitions of those. So you just go through and you tick off which one you have in your barn. I've just put pictures up of some of them. So here's a cupola again that was on that Rodden Park barn. Owl holes supposedly were to let owls into the barn to keep rats and mice down inside the barn. Not sure about that. And then the other thing that you see is there's all kinds of fig that were on the outsides of barns as well. So if you can take pictures of that, that's great. Here's the hay hood and the hay door that was on that Lemoyne Point barn. Things like, if you're lucky, you might find the date that the barn was built carved into the wood. So you got to really have a look at all the wood parts of the barn and see what's inscribed in there. This is a hay fork and a trolley. So this is the peak. This is looking straight up, and this is the peak of the barn. So a hay fork and a trolley. This was used to move hay off of a wagon into hay or straw into the barn. And interestingly, in the Rodden Park barn, I looked up and there was still the hay fork and the rope that was used to move that. So that moves along a trolley along the barn. And so that hay fork and rope were still in there, which amazed me after not quite 200 years. Manure litter carrier, so unfortunately I remember one of these from my father's first barn. So that you forked the manure from behind the cows into this bucket, and then it went on a track and you took it outside and dumped it. So hopefully there aren't too many of those left, because it wasn't much fun.
That was half of it. Once you got that litter carrier loaded, took it out and took from the spreader, and you had to take the two horses and take it out and spread it.
Yeah.
That was half the job done by the time you got the sleigh.
Well, and then they moved on to the manure gutters, right? And yeah. Yeah, I've tried to block it from my memory, but my father's long dead, but I don't know what he would say about that. We want information on the description of the barn complex, so we want to know what's attached to the barn. And it's amazing the variety of other structures that are attached to barns. There's milk houses, there's silos, there's other barns that are attached, there's barn bridges, root cellars. Again, this is my grandfather's barn or farm, and so this is from the 1950s. So somebody in the 1950s had an airplane that went around and took a lot of pictures of barns. And I don't know, I guess you can probably still get this done, but if you go into a lot of farmhouse kitchens, they'll have a picture that's very similar to this. So if you have a picture like this, by all means, put it into your old barn study. The other thing is, if you want to draw a schematic of the barn. So my father's second barn, I sat down one day and I drew this schematic of his stable. So with the barn, the milking stalls and the pens and all that, and so I uploaded that into the database. And then we want to know the current use of the barn. Is there livestock? Is it empty? Is it used for storage? Has it been repurposed and used for business? And so we just have a checklist. You just have to check off which applies. We want barn stories, so we have a section so you can freehand write in, a barn story or a barn memory, and then you can also upload historical barn pictures in there as well. And so we're connecting with another project that the University of Guelph is doing. It's called the PARO, P-A-R-O, but it's a People's Archive of Rural Ontario. And they are starting, well, they've been at this for a few years now, but they're collecting stories about agriculture in rural Ontario. And it's very interesting. If you want to go in and have a look at that, just Google PARO, P-A-R-O. So that last slide, I'd be, I guess, remiss if I didn't mention membership in Ontario Barn Preservation. It's not very expensive. It's only $35 for a one-year membership. I think that for that $35, there's some tangible benefits to you, I hope. Access to, as we get results from your old barn study, the Google Groups chat, the tenant talks, barn tours, all of the information on barns that's in the website. But I guess I would add that maybe the biggest benefit is it's more intangible, but by joining OBP, you're adding your voice to our organization. And one of the things I learned working with the federal government was that the more members you have in an organization, the more allied organizations with you, the more standing you have with the government, the bigger your voice with the government and your ability then to influence them. And so I would say that by joining OBP, you're adding your voice to ours, and hopefully we'll be able to save more barns. And that's it. Oh, I went way over.